Village life centers around a few scattered huts. Large families live together in these small, primitive shelters.
So I sat down to write the script for the next episode, The Origins of Human Language, and I kept having the same question pop up in my mind over and over again as I'm looking through all this ancient history. Like, how do we know when we were communicating and what the form of communication might have been? There's a lot of unanswered questions, but we'll get to that in a minute. Basically, I started having more questions than I had answers, no matter how much I dug up. And that's normal, I guess, for science. So I decided to take a little bit of a detour and sit down and write this episode, which talks about how we know what we know and how we know what we don't know, and are we even asking the right questions? It's kind of difficult. Cheers. So tonight I'm drinking the Dream Team. It's actually called the Dream Team. It's a double India Pale Ale from Portland, Maine, Lone Pine Brewing Company. I was there actually for a conference a little bit ago. It's a pretty good brewery. They do a lot of IPAs. So usually when you watch movies about the past, you're presented with a complete picture. I mean, you have to be. It's a movie, right? You know, you're presented with this perfect, complete image. But if we were to populate that image just with things that we're sure about, it would be pretty empty, especially further and further you go back, because we aren't too certain about a lot of things in the past, and you might be surprised at how much we don't know. Think about it like this. Victorian England is usually portrayed today as this kind of glowing era of progress and innovation where steam-powered contraptions roam the streets, but in reality it probably looked a little bit more like this, full of filthy, smoky, crowded, and noisy places. Medieval Europe is often depicted with glorious castles and knights in shining armor, but in reality they probably look more like this, and the soldiers more like this. And the further we go back, the more ambiguous things get, the more liberties we have to take in our visual depictions of what we thought these places looked like. More patchwork seems to appear between the tentatively connected facts that we have. Ancient Rome is often depicted like this, glorious, shining beacon of civilization, but yet for most people in Rome at the time, it looked more like this. People crammed together, living in filth and disease, with frequent fires and probably a pretty limited and terrible diet. And that by itself is just kind of speculation based off of the little facts that we have. And that's just part of the picture. Like, there's a lot of things that we don't know, and a lot of things that we don't know we don't know. So how do we sort this out? Alright, so we know some things and we don't know others. We got that much, right? But how much do we really not know? Bill Bryson pointed out in his book At Home that even just a couple of hundred years ago, there still holds a lot of significant mysteries. For example, on the dining table of upper middle class homes in England, there was a third spice on the table, a third container holding something, but we don't know what that something is. Maybe it was cinnamon. That's probably our best guess, but there's no guarantee that that was the case. We still don't know. And that was only 150 years ago, so think about how much speculation we have to make about things before then. But wait, then how do we know about other things? How do we know what people ate, what their values were, what they studied? So a slight deviation on knowing what we know. That subject is called epistemology, and it literally means the study of knowledge. Generally, there are two different categories of epistemology, at least in philosophical thought: rationalism and empiricism. Science is based off of empiricism, and I go more into the differences between these two in another video. It's going to be in the link below. But for the purpose of this video, we're going to stick with just science, empiricism, because that's what we use today. That means that we're gathering data based on observation and quantifying that using some kind of metric, something measurable, as set forth by John Locke and David Hume. So on this video, we're going to focus specifically on anthropological epistemology. That's a mouthful, but it's basically how we know what we know about people in the past. It's a good question. First, I wondered, how do we know that we had language? And how do we know that it was even spoken? You know, at first that question sounds pretty easy, right? Well, We have recordings of people in the recent past speaking.
Mr. Cole, what kind of parents did you have?
My father and grandfather were Baptist ministers.
You go back before that, well, of course, the camera and the video camera didn't exist, so all we have is the written language. We can generally assume that when they wrote it down, they were speaking it too. But if you go back far enough, are all written languages correlated to a spoken language? How do we know that's true? Well, the short answer is actually we don't. And before the recordings, we had people writing things down, poems, stories, financial records, meeting notes, all kinds of things. But you go back thousands of years and eventually you get to the oldest existing written language, which is the Mesopotamian tablet written in cuneiform. And that's the oldest evidence we ever had of a written abstract language. Did they actually have a spoken language to go along with that? Well, intuitively you would think yes, but actually, epistemologically, we don't have any evidence for that. What's more interesting is these languages, these spoken and written languages, probably developed independently. At least we know that the written ones did. Written languages developed in China, Central America, as well as the Middle and Near East. Now that's important because it shows that this revolution in thought did not start and spread genetically, like from one individual passing it down to his or her children and so on. It's some kind of trait that was in our ancestors tens of thousands of years ago, before they diverged and spread out across the globe. Now keep that in mind, that this is how written language developed, because that'll become important later. But for now, let's get back to epistemology. So we know humans had writing, but let's stop and think about that at a fundamental level. So it means we were capable of symbolic, abstract thought. Now, remember I mentioned that before in the consciousness episode I put out a couple months back, where we talked about Piaget's stages of cognitive development. Link again in the description for that episode. So they were just as physically developed as we were. It should be kind of intuitive. Evolution and adaptation happened over long periods of time, much longer than just a couple tens of thousands of years. But it also shows that they were able to communicate in some way what those symbols meant between one individual to another, so that there was not just a written form, they had to agree on what those symbols meant. Now that communication might have been pointing or grunts or tactile, touching other people to let them know what it is. We don't know exactly what that was, but we know that they had some kind of form of communication besides the written word. We can speculate even further based on this context that they were storing supplies, suggesting large-scale organization and leadership, that they were counting, implying an understanding of what at least basic mathematics was. But apart from that, how much can we really know? Well, we don't know how their leadership was constructed, or how a transfer of leadership occurred when a leader died or fell out of popularity. Was it even possible for leaders to fall out of popularity? I mean, could they be kicked out? I mean, did they vote them in? We have no idea how that leadership or social structure worked, let alone things like clothing, gender roles, what their diet was like, economics, or anything. Now that brings us to a key point. Everything we know about ancient humans and anthropology comes from the archaeological record. We make deductions and generalizations based on what evidence we find, and that evidence sometimes can be very limited. By patching fragmented clues together, we can kind of create this patchwork of what a snapshot of life might have looked like for these people at this certain time. But even that isn't always really that straightforward either. Sometimes you'll find two fragments, maybe a bowl fragment and something carved on stone, that were found in the same place, supposedly by the same civilization, but they could span 50 years. Since we're talking about timescales of tens of thousands of years, 50 years doesn't really sound like much, but consider what 50 years means in our society. Think about what was happening 50 years ago in our own civilization.
And we as a people will get to the promised land.
The 747 is a giant among aircraft.
And we had liftoff at 2:13. The Saturn V building up to 7.6 million pounds of thrust, and it is
American soldiers hiking their way through the sweaty jungles of South Vietnam.
Now think about 100 years ago or 200 years ago. I mean, can you imagine trying to get along with your grandparents when they were your age? Their train of thought was completely different. Their worldview was completely different. Some of us wouldn't have even had the luxury of freedom 200 years ago. Now, granted, our rapidly advancing technology has made an impact on our society. But even so, there are changes in morality that occur over periods of hundreds of years. In the US, we like to think of what the founding fathers would have done. But it's really unlikely that any of us would have gotten along with the founding fathers at all. We value different things now than they did then. Even if those changes are relatively small, it still made a huge impact on our art, on our culture, on the way we view the world, and that would be reflected in our archaeological evidence. But there are other ways of deducing facts without examining them directly. Consider, for example, Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe is an archaeological site in some remote area of Turkey, and it's really interesting by itself and deserves some consideration. But for our purposes, what's really interesting about it is the big stone pillars. Now, Göbekli Tepe has been around for at least 9,000 to 11,000 years, and that's huge. It's the oldest known site of civilization in the world, oldest known evidence of permanent civilization. Decades of investigation have shown that it's gone through at least 2 stages of significant development. But remember those stone pillars. Those are huge. They're at least 9 metric tons each, and there's a whole bunch of them, and they're monolithic. It means they couldn't have been assembled there. They were moved and placed as one large single unit. And that requires manpower, lots of manpower. You can't do this with 1 or 2 people, or probably even with a couple of dozen. That in itself can be a clue. So these people would have had their hands occupied, so sign language or tactile communication would have been out. So there's your evidence for vocal communication spanning at least 10,000 years. But it probably goes back further. I mean, consider for a minute reconstructing this civilization, this 10,000-year-old civilization, just from evidence found at one site, which spans several hundred years. So 2 pieces of evidence show 2 possibly different civilizations, different cultures, different people, different generations, and yet you're trying to assemble a snapshot of life with these fragmented clues. It's like going through someone else's code and they didn't leave comments, and it's just a mess, really. But you do what you can. And then there's art, like art that's found in the caves of Lascaux in France. This is one of the oldest known locations for art and evidence of human existence, and it's 18,000 years old. Almost double the age of Göbekli Tepe. Now, this cave shows evidence of a complex society, and the people that lived there, they were called the Magdalenians, or at least that's what we call them. We don't really know what they call themselves. We have no way of knowing. They didn't leave a written record, and even if we did, it would be really difficult to translate that into some kind of verbal sound without any context. So all we know of this society is that they returned to this site many times over hundreds and hundreds of years. And all the clues that we can deduce about their existence, their culture, their lifestyle is from the art and small clues they left in this single cave. But they did leave behind some clues that are pretty interesting. For example, we know that they specialized. They had dedicated artists. So that evidence of specialization is, again, an evidence that there was some kind of communication. Probably verbal, but it could have been something else as well. That means that some of them stayed behind and worked on art while others went and gathered. And who did what would have had to have been communicated at some point, as well as passing down the skills to make the dyes from one generation to another. Now, granted, that could be done through observation, but I kind of find it hard to believe that people who were genetically identical to us would have had an entire culture and civilization not based off of at least some kind of verbal communication. But there's still a lot of mysteries there. Why did they return to this specific cave over and over again? Why did they make this art? Why did they feel that this art was so important that they had to dedicate members of their society to accomplishing this singular task? I mean, maybe just to let people know that, hey, we were here, we existed. And that's kind of the problem with this. I mean, we know that we don't know certain things, but there's also so many unasked questions that we don't even have the information to ask. The things that we don't know. And the reason for that is that most of the evidence, the archaeological evidence, is gone by the time it reaches us through time. Wood rots, pottery turns to dust, leather and most tools decay or erode, and all we're left with are the most durable of fragments. And by their very nature, the durable stuff is usually harder to work with, so it probably won't reflect the most sophisticated aspects of that society. I mean, the most sophisticated things we have, the fine components in our smartphones, our computers, the satellites in orbit, all of them will be gone in a couple of thousands of years, at least almost all of them. All of our sophistication, if something were to happen, no one would know the level of advancement we've made. And thus, what we have to work with, what's left over from these societies, is unfortunately probably not the best of what that society had to offer. That's a lot of stuff to take in about the ancient world in one video. So let's back off a bit. I think you get what I'm trying to say here. Finding out specific answers, asking the right questions can lead to some dead ends. And that's kind of what I've been facing when I've been digging up, origins of human language. And, linguists that might be watching will be like, well, that's not a surprise, right? But for people like me who pass through this topic as I go from one subject to another, I'm always surprised at where and how big those blind spots are when we look back at our own history. Remember that we don't even know what the third shaker was for just 150 years ago. And as I mentioned, the problem is that before we even get started, we don't know what we don't know. It's kind of frustrating. So I wonder what mysteries will leave our descendants in 200 years. So I hope this sets the tone about the next video and any other videos I cover in the future about our ancient past. This kind of work is hard, and the more I dig into it, the more I appreciate the people who work with this stuff all day, every day. They spend their lives piecing together fragments of cultures and trying to build a picture of our past so that we can understand ourselves more. And I think it's really important that we take the time to consider where we came from and avoid making mistakes again. And even just take some time to better understand who we are and how we got here. All right, guys, thanks for watching. Cheers. So I had to pause the camera because it was overheating. It does that sometimes. And it was actually really good timing. We got to go out and watch the launch. And the benefit of that is you get this really cool scene thing. So they would have had to have communicated of me being startled by the sonic boom. Challenges of living near a space center.